Well, good morning, everybody. For those of you who weren't here in Sunday school, my name's Robert Carter. I happen to be a scientist, but the most important part of my life is that I'm a follower of Jesus Christ. And I'm here to tell you that when you come to church, you don't have to turn off your brain. Now, I am a marine biologist by training. I spent years scuba diving in Florida and the Bahamas and Belize. It was a tough life, just having to... And I'm studying these animals called corals, which are quite mysterious animals. And I'm looking at their colorations. And I'm seeing that they're bright green and bright red and purple and white and just lovely. I mean, I'm just exulting in God's creation. And as I'm studying them, I said, hey, what are those colors made out of? And that became my PhD topic because nobody knew at the time. And I said, okay, well, there's all these other pigments in the animal world, so I'm starting to do taking corals, grinding them up, and doing chemical extractions, and nothing was working until I decided to try to extract proteins. And my protein extraction was bright green. I said, that's proteins? I'm made of proteins, and I don't glow under a black light. What's going on? But once I realized that there's a protein there, I knew there's a gene behind it. And so my doctorate was stealing the genes out of corals and engineering them into fish. So it's really genetic engineering. And that opens up a giant can of worms. Is that moral? Are we allowed to monkey around with God's creation? How far can we go in science before we transgress one of God's laws? Well, Christian, those questions are staring you in the face every time you go to the doctor's office, every time you go to the grocery store. These sorts of questions are in front of us, and we need to be able to go through this world wisely, making intelligent, godly decisions. Now, in my laboratory, we were working on a human cancer model. We wanted, when the fish got cancer in a gene that we know causes human cancer, the tumor would be green. And when we cured the fish, it would stop being green. Oh, okay. So honestly, the sacrifice of the life of a few fish to save people, I think is a quite noble endeavor. Genesis chapter 1 has something very interesting. We call it the dominion mandate. This is God talking to Adam and Eve. He says to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. That's telling us that Adam and Eve were put on this earth as stewards of God's creation. And as their descendants, we will have inherited that responsibility. To be a steward, to have dominion, you need to understand what you're trying to take care of, or you'll be a lousy steward. I mean, if you're a farmer, you better understand the needs of your cows and your crops. If you're a parent, you better understand the needs of your children. If you're a pet owner, you better understand the needs of your pet. But that understanding, that pursuit of knowledge is another word for science. Science exists so that we can work in God's created world, taking care of what God has created us to do. When He gives us stuff, we're supposed to take care of it through the pursuit of science so we can do it better. Because science and the Bible are not fighting each other. We've been writing about that in over 46 or 47 years now in a Creation magazine. Our website, creation.com, we have 13,000 articles, something like that. I mean, I can almost guarantee you that if you've got a question when we're done today and you go to our website, type something in the search box, that something's going to pop up that answers the question. In fact, if it doesn't pop up or you don't like the answer, send us an email. I spend about half my time answering people's emails. And many of those answers become new articles on our website. We exist to feed you. We're an information ministry. We put our heads together and say, okay, now what do we need to answer today? And answer. We put it out there so regular old people say, oh, I've always wondered about that. And now I have an answer for it. We're also all over social media. We've got a multi-million-dollar social media campaign going on right now. In fact, we just flew a film crew from Australia to the U.S. Over 3 days, we filmed 13 hours of interviews that we're breaking up into 1-minute TikToks and longer YouTubes, and we are very busy with this. This is what CMI does. But if you ask me, when I was a young person, 17, 18, 19 years old, hey Carter, why do you believe in evolution? What would I have told you? Well, I would have probably thrown Pakicetus in your face. This is a National Geographic. I mean, come on. The perfect transitional form between land animals and whales. I needed no other information, I thought. This was it. This is my proof of evolution. I did not know that that fanciful cartoon was based only on those blue bones. Nothing below the neck at all. I did not know that in the 80s they'd discover the rest of the skeleton, or that today, modern depictions of Pakicetus, it looks like a 4-foot-long rat dog with 0 transitional features. And I said to myself, I think I've been lied to. What else do I have to unlearn? You know what? The process of unlearning is harder than the process of learning. And all of us have to unlearn the worldly system that's coming to us, either in our upbringing or on television or on whatever. It's coming at us all the time. We have to take that and reinterpret it to honor God with that. It's hard. But we've got more information on this topic than any other time in church history. We should be shouting from the rooftops all across America that the Bible is true. And yet most people in our country have never heard that. Most people in most churches in this country have never heard that. I grew up in one of the classically liberal denominations that's been hemorrhaging millions of people over the last couple of decades. And that denomination actually has no statement of faith. And when I hit 18 years old and I'm leaving home, I knew nothing about the Bible, even though I was one of my only friends who kept going to church my whole life. And I was involved in their youth group movement and the county-wide stuff, and I knew nothing. But I don't think that's unusual. So we took a TV camera. We went around to 5 or 6 college campuses in the Atlanta area, and we interviewed several hundred students. And we put these interviews together into something called Fallout. Students explain why they left or remained in the church. And man, we had some very interesting interviews. But amongst the hundreds that we interviewed, we found 100 students who said, when we asked them the question, were you raised in the church? We found 100 of them and said, yes. Next question was, hey, which is true, creation or evolution? Take a guess. 5 said creation. And then we said, were we ever taught about creation and evolution? Same 5. And then we said, are you still attending church? Take a guess. 6. It's not bulletproof. I know plenty of nice homeschool kids who grew up on, the Christian curriculum. They have very, difficult to pronounce Bible names. Even, we know those people, right? Okay. And I know several of them today who are just total atheists. Okay. But there is a strong trend. Churches that preach this from the pulpit, Sunday schools that talk about this, families who have conversations about creation and evolution over the dining room table, were raising a group of young Christians who are much more willing to identify with Christ in an incredible anti-Christian environment called the American University. I know of no greater engine for creating atheists than USA colleges. But what are we going to do about this? Because most of us don't know science. We say evolution, how do you answer that question? And all of us have giant questions that we can't answer. That's just true. And yet, if evolution, humans evolved from apes, billions of years, radiometric dating, and all those sorts of questions are preventing people from accepting the truths of the Bible, then it's up to us to try to answer those questions. And yet, we have to give them an alternative explanation where we're not even sure of it ourselves. Can I give you a help? Every Friday, we send out an email. It'll be a list of the articles we wrote that week. Might point you to some new resource. We might even have an interview with a former revolutionist. There's no telling what we might have in our email. Very often, there'll be some new scientific pronouncement that says, this proves evolution. Well, we'll say, oh yeah? We'll get one of our people to write an article. We'll get it on our website before Thursday night, so on our Friday mailing, there's an answer for something that came up just a couple of days before. It's a great way to stay plugged into the type of information that CMI is producing. Now, if you would like to get our email, it's really, really easy. We're going to hand this out while I'm speaking. It's just a sign-up form. We ask for a name, an email address, and a zip code. And what's the zip code there for? Well, every time we send a speaker out, and we're going to do about 1,300 events this year. We're very busy. We'll send an email to everyone with a certain radius. Hey, come on, bring a friend. I'm sure there's people here now. Definitely will be people here this afternoon that will have gotten that. So these gentlemen are handing these out. Feel free, if you don't want it, no big deal. Just pass the person next to you. And when it comes to the end of a row, can you just turn back and see if it went to the row behind you yet? And when they're finished, can you do me another favor? Pass them to the ends, because these gentlemen are going to collect them in a couple of minutes. All right, so those are going around, and without too much distraction, we're going to be talking about science. Oh, but we have to define what that means. And it's very hard to define the word. So let me give you two different types of science. This will help us understand this creation and evolution debate. One, it's called operational science, sometimes experimental science, sometimes engineering. But operational science is observing and testing and repeating experiments today. And that type of science has led to the development of all of our modern technologies, including nuclear-powered rovers that NASA drives around Mars. And yet, this type of science, which is the backbone of everything in our modern society, has nothing to do with evolution. This is just figuring out how things work. And this type of thinking was pioneered by Christians. This did not come to us from ancient Greece. Why? Because you can't do science if there's a Zeus. What if Zeus doesn't like you? You can't do science if there's a Loki. You can't do science if there are pixies in the garden that are mischievous that might sneak through a crack in your window at night and rearrange the labels on your test tubes. You can't do science until you can trust the universe. We had to get rid of paganism for science to flourish. And so we had men like Johann Kepler, the great astronomer, who discovered the 3 laws of planetary motion that NASA used to fly things around the solar system today. And he said of his work, it was like thinking God's thoughts after him. To be a scientist is a privilege. You know why? Because we get to discover things that God hid in creation thousands of years ago. And it is amazing and absolutely shocking and humbling and a privilege. And yet most scientists are really arrogant. Yeah. And it's pretty sad that they use their science to deny the God that created the world in which science works. In fact, you ever struggle in science class? Yeah. Remember those horrible formulas in chemistry and physics? Another formula. All right. Take out the Greek letters. What are you left with? You're left with the initials of people's names. And essentially, every single one of those initials is the initials of a Christian's name. Because Christians gave us modern science. They gave us a way of thinking, and they pioneered, as soon as we developed this way of thinking, that there's an all-powerful God who never lies, he doesn't change his mind, he's the ultimate lawgiver, and anything he does according to his nature. Well, the ultimate lawgiver is going to create a universe that operates according to law. And boom, the thought that God is upholding the universe, infusing the universe with his power and his nature is what gave us modern science. But you'll never hear that in science class. You'll never hear that in history class. They don't want you to know that. But it's irrefutable. And yet, most science today are not Christians. Okay, I know that quite well. Why? Well, because there are other forms of science. Here's one. It's called historical science. It's when you reach back in time and try to explain something you could not possibly have witnessed. Can you see that the further back in time you go, the less certain you should be about what happened? But think of history. How many times has history happened? It's not repeatable. And like I said earlier, we don't have time machines. You can't go back. You can't repeat it. It's not testable. So historical science is not the same thing as operational science. And yet this is the center of the debate. We're not arguing over the boiling point of water. We're arguing over, did some stumpy-legged fish crawl out of an ocean 500 million years ago, or is the universe even that old? Those are questions that no one can actually witness for themselves. We can only extrapolate. Can you see the difference between two different sciences? Well, I'm giving you a quiz anyway. Science class, pop quiz. One question, true or false? Is this how fossils form? We have a dinosaur sinking to the bottom of some sea. He rots and his bones are lying there. And over, I presume, a very long period of time, he's buried and petrified. And then I assume plate tectonics happens and rocks are lifted up and erosion exposes a dinosaur skeleton in a hill. True or false? Is that how fossils form? Who says true? Good. Who says false? What 90% of you are not going to answer my trick question? I give this in a Christian school in Minnesota, and all the kids raise their hands true. And I look at the teachers in the back. I say, hey, teachers, you got your hands full. Because here's elementary and middle school kids, and they've already accepted the evolutionary story. This is demonstrably false. I am a marine biologist. I know what happens to things when they hit the bottom of the ocean. And yet they put this in a children's museum on purpose, because it gives the children a false understanding of how fossils form. And those false things are hard to get out of your brain once they're in there. I know that. I wrote an article once for a journal of creation, and the reviews, now my name's taken off, it's sent out for peer review. No one knows who wrote it. I don't know who reviewed it. One of the reviewers was, who is this guy? He writes like an evolutionist. I said, oh, he's right. I had a holdover thought that I hadn't yet cleared out of my brain yet. So it happens to everybody. But look, let's get in a submarine. Let's look around the bottom of the ocean. Let's find a big dead thing. What do you think you're going to see? Yuck. Bones are full of fat and protein. They get eaten. According to the laws of chemistry, the calcium in the bones will dissolve in seawater. Oh. So suddenly science has to explain fish that look like they were petrified before they began to rot fossils. Or fish that are eating fish fossils, of which we have many. Or mother ichthyosaurs in the process of giving birth fossils. One of my favorites, salamanders. This salamander, his gills are there. The tail's only a few cells thick. How do you turn something like that to stone? Does the millions of years version of geology have a good answer for something like this? No, not really. Because clearly it was petrified before it rotted. Have you ever had a goldfish that died? How long did it take that goldfish before it starts to fall apart? Not very long, a couple of days maybe, and yet a beautiful, perfect, complete, petrified before it began to rot fossil tells us no to the millions of years. Well, here's a historical model of how this might happen. Here's Goldie. He's happily swimming along in the ocean on the morning of Noah's flood, and he gets overwhelmed by some underwater avalanche, and now he's dead. But he's buried in mud, and the mud has water in it, and the water has dissolved salts and minerals in it. And under the heat and the pressure and the low oxygen condition, maybe we can force some of those minerals into him before he completely rots away, and we might be left with what we call a fossil. Now, in the dinosaur talk earlier, we saw that there are non-petrified remains of some dinosaurs. But most of the time, you have to petrify, you have to permineralize a specimen, or there's not going to be anything left. We have a documentary that's on a table out here. It's called Evolution's Achilles Heels. This is 3 years of my life that went into this. In fact, we've won 2 awards at Christian film festivals. Was it 10 years ago? It was the San Antonio Independent Christian Film Festival. There were 13 documentaries submitted. We were second place. We lost to Mike Huckabee. Just, but I was very proud of that showing. And the amount of comments we've gotten from this is amazing. All we did was interview Bible-believing PhD scientists. We said, okay, nerd, tell us. What can evolution not answer in your area of expertise? And they said the most incredible things. This is Dr. Marcus Ross. He's a paleontologist, a fossil expert. He said, the existence of a fossil by itself is actually proof that something happened very, very fast. But then he says, but the fossil occurred quickly. The rock that contains the fossil must also have occurred quickly. So now we're talking about the entire fossil record is a record of fast things, not slow things, or the fossils wouldn't be there, including things like this. This is a petrified tree. It's called a polystrate, a many-layered polystrate fossil that sticks vertically through the geologic column and defies evolutionary time. Because how long does it take for a tree to rot or burn or get eaten by termites? Dead trees don't stick up out of the ground waiting to be petrified and buried. That doesn't happen. Hey, you see what I'm doing? Do you see the transgression, the trajectory of my thoughts here? I'm trying to get you to do something. I'm trying to get you to question time. All the examples I just give you can be explained in a short time, not a long time. The amount of time is a critical question. But where does the millions of years idea come from? Certainly not the Bible. In fact, through most of Christian history, all the scholars said the earth's only thousands of years old. It wasn't until the 1800s when that was starting to be questioned. But the millions of years concepts comes from us, from geologists, most of them European, who are looking at the world and they're trying to explain things using only what we see happening in the world today. No appeal to a miracle, no appeal to a flood, only what we can directly witness today. Well, the world's not being flooded. We have rain and rivers and lightning and wind, and those things erode things very slowly. So, obviously, it took millions of years to carve the Grand Canyon, right? That's how that thought works. But what if slow and gradual doesn't explain what we see? Like, for example, there's a flat plane that the canyon is carved into. But if you stand on the south rim of the Grand Canyon, you look to the north, you see what's called the Grand Staircase. It's a multicolored stack of mile-high rocks that goes up and up and up as it goes towards the horizon. Bryce Canyon is in the middle of that, a couple of the famous landmarks. But on this plain around Grand Canyon, there are hills. And every once in a while, a hill will pop up, has the same exact layers as we see to the north. Therefore, something erased the earth down a mile and created a flat plain. Whoa. And then carved a canyon in the top of a hill. Because the high point of the canyon is the middle, not the beginning. The Colorado River runs through a giant, rather flat, but it's still pretty high. We call it a mountain if it was more narrow. You remember this? 5 years ago, I think it was, highest dam in the United States nearly failed. Oroville Dam in Northern California, they had too much snow that year, and as the snow was melting, the dam filled up, and if that thing had burst, we would have lost like 300,000 homes downstream. It was a major catastrophe waiting to happen. So the engineer said, we got to drain the lake, turn on the water. And they let it first go down the emergency spillway. There was too much erosion, so they went down the main spillway, and just over a couple of days, honestly, that's not a lot of water compared to the size of major world rivers. That's not a big hill compared to the size of the world or how far down most rivers have to go when they're flowing down from mountains. And yet this water ate through steel-reinforced concrete and carved a side channel 1,300 feet long, 400 feet wide, and 160 feet deep through solid rock, which is now the gravel out in the riverbed. I thought erosion was slow. Well, it can be, But even under natural conditions, we can see erosion happening very, very quickly through a process called cavitation. Any boat owners in the room? Have you ever had to replace an old propeller where the back edge started getting pitted? That's not from salt water. That's from a process called cavitation. What happens is water will flow over surface nice and smoothly until it gets a little too fast, and then it'll pop up and create a vacuum that goes, and that imploding vacuum will eat through stainless steel. It'll eat through solid rock. So if you ask me, hey Carter, how long did it take to carve the Grand Canyon? You know what I'm going to say? I don't know. How fast is the water flowing? And the waters draining off the earth at the end of Noah's flood is a perfect recipe for massive amounts of very fast erosion. Now, I've always been a little nerd. Here's me, 5th grade, back when I had hair. I miss my hair. But I'm living on the East Coast. My parents owned a marina. We're in a beach town on Long Island. It's a beautiful place to grow up, a little teeny town. And something very strange was happening. For several weeks at the end of my 5th grade year, the sunrises were really weird, like red, like horror movie red. Like my room was filled with red lights. Like, what is going on? Well, it turns out that my little scientific gears are like, hey, something really cool is happening because this mountain 3,000 miles away from my house had just exploded. And it was affecting the weather on the other side of the continent. Now, I did not know it at the time, but Mount St. Helens is one of the greatest things ever to happen for, if you would, creationist geology. Why? Because we now know. I love that phrase. When a scientist says we now know, do you know what that means? It means I was wrong yesterday. That's exactly what it means. We now know it does not take millions of years to form many different types of rock and many different types of rock formations. This is not Grand Canyon. This is stuff laid down by that volcano in May of 1980, June of 1980, and I think it was March of 1982. Boom, boom, boom. And if you zoom up on that middle layer here, you see these little fine laminations. This is not count up the layers, count up the years, layers, millions of years. This is an explosion of volcanic ash and steam coming racing down the mountain at the speed of a hurricane that created all those layers. Interesting. But notice what I haven't done yet. I haven't talked much about the Bible. Talk about fossils, talk about the age of the earth, talk about evolution. What does the Bible have to say about such things? Well, let's take some time and look at it a little bit. First of all, let's acknowledge, like it or not, the Bible claims to be the history book of the universe. Unlike, I think, any other religious book in the world, it has an account of where everything came from, the reason why it is the way it is, and where everything is going. And if you look at that first page, you're hit with a very stark realization. The Bible claims the universe was created in 6 consecutive days. If you add up the time spans, it's only a few thousand years ago. Now, I tried to add evolution to this every way you could imagine. My first attempt, I didn't know it was called the day-age theory. I must have heard it from somebody, but I said, oh, what if each of the days was really a long period of time? Okay, that's a valid question. But then someone said, Rob, you can't get plants millions of years before you get the sun. Oh, yeah. Oh, well, maybe this is just evolutionary theory. Maybe it's just Hebrew poetry or something trying to explain evolutionary time. No, because God said he created all the flying creatures on day 5. That includes pterosaurs, bats, and birds. But evolution teaches that those things evolved from land animals, which weren't created until later. It's like when God set this up, he deliberately set up the order of events to thwart all naturalistic explanations. If you're struggling with this, I know someone in this room is struggling with this. I understand the struggle, my friends. But if you're struggling with this, I want to encourage you, keep struggling. It's always worth fighting with the Word of God. Always, if you're willing to accept what it actually says. And sometimes, people like me, being so stubborn, we have to bash our head against this brick wall many times before we realize it's not going to move. But then, The next question comes is, okay, what do I do about this then? If I'm going to accept this as true, the world's going to laugh at me. Yeah, Christian, the world's going to laugh at you. Yep. But you know what? You already believe that Jesus didn't have a father and that he rose from the dead. You're already crazy. What are you worried about this for? Now, the reason we're talking about this, though, is not for the Old Testament's sake. It's because of the way the New Testament uses Genesis. You must understand, there's over 100 references to Genesis in the New Testament. About 60 or so of those come from the first 11 chapters. What's the first 11 chapters of the Bible? That's creation, Noah's flood, and the Tower of Babel. Oh, every single New Testament author references those 11 chapters. Even Jesus, at least 16 times in the Gospels, including this one, Mark chapter 10. He starts off by quoting the opening words of the book of Genesis in Greek, but from the beginning. From the beginning of creation, a quote of Genesis, God made them male and female. Another quote of Genesis, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and two shall become one flesh. Hey, did Jesus believe that Adam and Eve existed at the beginning of creation? Then Jesus didn't believe in the evolutionary timeline. Because in the evolutionary timeline, we have something like a Big Bang 13 billion years ago, or more now. The space telescope's saying it must be longer than that, but let's just say the old number, 13 billion years ago. And then Homo sapiens appears like yesterday, at the end of the timeline. But the Bible doesn't have that timeline. The Bible has day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, humans. Day 6, humans. And then a few thousand years till today. We started at the beginning, like Jesus hints there. But I understand most people don't believe that. But look what Jesus told Nicodemus the Pharisee. Nicodemus came to him at night. He says, how can these things be? He says, how can a man be born again? And Jesus replies very interestingly, if I have told you earthly things and you do not believe, how can you believe if I tell you heavenly things? So if the earthly things in the Bible aren't true, that might be the history, the science, those are the earthly things. The same people who wrote the wrong history and the wrong science are the same people who wrote the theological things, the heavenly things in the Bible. So how do you tease them apart? At which point does the Bible start becoming true? At which point is each individual writer true or false? And if they've filled the Bible up with falsehoods, how do you trust the rest of it? It's like the spiritual baby gets thrown out with the earthly bathwater. And so Christians, we must decide how much of the Bible is true. Is Genesis chapter 1 true? Then we have to stand against every single college professor in this country. And that is intimidating. And the world is laughing at you. In fact, Hollywood pretends you don't even exist. Who can name a Christian character on television? What? Really? None? Yeah, there are a couple, and they usually come off like Homer Simpson's next door neighbor. I mean, they're usually not portrayed as sane people. But the Bible is consistent in its treatment of Genesis as a foundational document. Paul says here in Romans 5, therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, so death spread to all men because all sinned. Who's that one man? Adam. Oh, whoa, 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 whoa. There's no death before Adam sinned? Then there's no evolution. Because evolution requires billions of years of death to produce you. But no, death is a foreign thing. Death is the enemy. Death is part of the curse. Death is that thing that will be removed when Christ comes back. Christ's death on the cross was there to pay for Adam's sin. If Adam was going to die anywhere, if Adam was produced through a process of death and selection, what does Jesus hang on the cross for? But if death was a curse, Jesus becomes that curse. He answers the problem. Oh, so evolution is actually cutting the heart out of the gospel. Saved from what in an evolutionary context? Well, in the Genesis context, saved from eternal damnation in hell for sinful people who haven't taken up the name of Christ. Oh. But we get this idea that death is a punishment from Genesis chapter 2. The Lord God commanded the man, saying, "You may surely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. From the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die." Christian, don't get sidetracked here. It doesn't say he'll die on that day in Hebrew. The word death is used twice. It's just like when Jesus says, "Truly, truly, I say to you," it's an emphasis. The emphasis here is on death, as in dying, you will die. God is guaranteeing that if you sin, you will die. That's a punishment for sin. That's why Adam didn't die on that day, but he definitely did die. But Adam did that. He took the fruit from that tree. He ate it. And God said, "Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life." But it's not the dirt that's cursed. It's a universe. Oh, Romans 8. I remember the day I realized how many references to creation were in Romans 8. I was shocked. The creation waits with eager longing. The creation was subjected to futility. The creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption. The whole creation. The Greek word there means everything. The universe, if you would. The whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. He keeps harping on the fact that the entire universe is weighed down by the weight of Adam's sin. That makes no sense in an evolutionary context. And Paul certainly didn't believe in evolution either. Oh, but there's still a hope for us. Look at the end of the Bible, second to last chapter, Revelation 21. He, Jesus, will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things are passed away. What are the former things? It's all that junk we got from Adam. Why do I say that? Because in the same context it says, "There's no more curse." Oh, you ever realize that the end of the Bible is fixing the problem set up at the beginning of the Bible? And you know what happens right after this? The tree of life reappears. Oh, it's like Revelation and Genesis are like bookends on a consistent story. The Bible is not a taxonomy book. It's not a science book. It's a story of God trying to find a bride for his son. That's what the Bible is about. It does talk about science, yes, and it should not be wrong about science, but it's not a fount of all scientific knowledge. So we struggle with some of the science in the Bible. But clearly, it is about God saving his people. You know what this is? This black squiggly line, those are all the chapters in the Bible. The rainbow, those are the thousands of cross-references amongst all the chapters in the Bible. You can't pull the first several chapters out without destroying the integrity of the rest of Scriptures. Why? Because later biblical authors will quote from life of Adam or Cain or Noah and make big spiritual conclusions. In the same way they'll quote from the life of King David or Absalom or Solomon and make big... They don't treat them any different. Okay, here's an illustration. I'm a huge fan of J.R.R. Tolkien. Yes, I watched the movies, the books, so I'm just more nerdy than most people, sorry. I bet I've read The Lord of the Rings 15 times. Similarly, in Lost Tales, Unfinished Tales, I love that world. And yet, if I was to open up any passage that the guy wrote, and I was to read it to you, and claim it was history, what would you do? You would call me a heretic and you would drive me out of this stage. Why? Because I'd be lying. It's not history. It was made up. The biblical authors treat Genesis as if it was history. Uh-oh. That means they thought it was true. So Christian, I suggest that maybe we ought to think it's true also. Doesn't mean we have all the answers to all the questions, but we better approach this from a truth perspective than a skeptical perspective, because this is a very important topic. But if this really did happen, if Genesis really is true, then we don't have millions of years. If we don't have millions of years, we have to explain things like the fossil record. Oh, how do we do that in a short amount of time? Well, you remember the Mount St. Helens example, the Oroville Dam near disaster example. I could have given you any number of local catastrophes where we show things happen quickly. But what if something larger happened in Earth's history? Of course, I'm pointing at Noah's flood now. About 1,600 years after this scene in the garden, we have a man named Noah, and the world had become so corrupt, God basically says, I'm going to push a reset button. And he says to a man named Noah, the only righteous person he found, he says, I've determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. So we told Noah to build a large ship. We call it an ark. And in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th. I know most of you don't like science. It's a sad fact of the world. But for you English majors, can you help me? I got really bad marks in English. In fact, the reason I didn't become an engineer at Georgia Tech is my grades in high school were so bad they didn't trust I was actually going to perform well. I went and got a PhD, okay, fine, but I am not gifted in languages. In fact, now I'm an author and a proofreader. I think my English teachers are turning over in their graves. So people gifted in languages, help me. What genre is that? Is that poetry? Is that prophecy? Is that allegory? Or is that historical narrative? Does that say that a specific thing happened on a specific day of a specific person's life? Yeah, it's written like history. On that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, the windows of heaven were opened, and rain fell upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Okay, that's nice. Did that really happen? Well, if it happened, you have evidence. If it happened, what would you expect the results to be? The reason I ask it that way is because the church in the 1800s got that question wrong. But today, everywhere I'm going, I'm looking for evidence of Noah's flood. And if we train our brains, we can see it. So let me give you two big ideas, two things to look for. One, think pancakes, stacks of rocks, one on top of another, on top of another, on top of another, generally with no evidence of erosion in between. But when we look at the Grand Canyon, you look at all those layers, the big layers, there's millions of years missing between the sections. In fact, most of the time, the wall of the Grand Canyon is in the gaps between the layers. 10 million years, 30 million years, 1.2 billion years. That's the length of time in those gaps that we're told. Well, that's weird, because during that time, these rocks would have been exposed to the atmosphere. They weren't underwater accumulating dirt. They were up, which means they would have eroded. And yet you can have a millions, hundreds of millions of years gap, and it's perfectly flat, and the next layer is exactly flat on top of it, as if the time really didn't exist. Even more strangely, some of those sandstones are under our feet right now. They outcrop near where I live in northwest Georgia. You can find them in Canada. These layers, tens of thousands of square miles in extent, at most a few hundred feet thick, they're proportionally thinner than a sheet of paper. And yet, let's find a modern analog. Where do we find sand being deposited? Beach, river deltas. You never find sand sheeting out across the ocean. As soon as the water hits, even the Mississippi River, all the mud falls out. That fine mud particles falls out and makes a delta. So how do you get sand across a continent? Well, something really big must have washed it there. How do you get sand in a flat layer across a continent? And then you have sandstone, limestone, shale, you have mudstones, huge extents. This is Noah's flood remnants. Okay, now after the pancakes, and then we stack all these rocks up, what's going to happen to these rocks as the waters are coming off the continents? Well, I predict a massive amount of erosion. But this erosion is not going to occur in river valleys. We're talking about sheets of water that might carve some very strange landforms. You've seen Monument Valley. If you ever watch a John Wayne movie, about half of them are filmed here in Monument Valley, right? Have you ever noticed that all those buttes and mesas have the same height? They're carved from a plane. In fact, these rocks, when you go north, these rocks dip underneath other rocks. There's about, again, a mile of missing rocks. What erased the surface of the earth down about a mile to create a flat plain and then ate into the plain with no evidence of a river? No, I think this is the waters of Noah's flood erasing the surface of the earth, and as they start petering out, they start losing some of their power, and as they finally dissipate, they leave some really weird things behind, which are not being created by modern erosion. Everything in the world today is rounding these things off. Nothing's creating vertical cliffs. And where are all the rocks that fell off of these things over millions of years? Where's all the eroded sand? Well, it's been washed off the continent. And just to the west, again, look, we have Grand Canyon. A flat plain, mile down, river-carved canyon on top of a hill. That puny little Colorado River carved this? That's a huge, just wide. No, rivers tend to go, they don't tend to go. Most rivers, valleys in the world have what's called an underfit stream in them. The Jordan River in Israel is a classic example. You have the Jordan Valley, and then you have a canyon inside it in which the river is. That tiny little river in a narrow canyon, which is inside a bigger canyon. And the Grand Canyon, you got a big canyon inside a smaller, you have a tiny canyon inside of a bigger canyon inside of a bigger canyon. There's multiple layers of erosion. This does not look like a river carved it. It looks like Noah's flood carved it. And yet, one more thing for you. We have to understand that Noah's flood is not a kid story. This is actually a horror story. This is not Noah and his wife on the deck, and there's a toucan on the roof, and a giraffe sticking his neck out the window smiling. No, this is the wrath of God poured out on wickedness. This is death. This is judgment. This is ugly. And yet, in the middle of all that, there's a beautiful picture. Because through faith in God, Noah was taken through that judgment, and he came out alive on the other side. What does the New Testament tell us? That anyone who puts their faith in Jesus Christ, we usher through that second fiery judgment, come out alive on the other side to inherit eternal life in heaven. How do you survive the wrath of God? It's through faith. And Noah showed us that. Did you know that the gospel and creation are kind of wrapped up together? It's amazing. When I started giving these talks nearly 20 years ago, I didn't know how to add the gospel to my creation talks. And now I don't want to talk about science at all. I just want to talk about Jesus and the Bible and salvation. But I get to use the science to question the evolutionary science. And once you do that, what's the replacement? Biblical science. And biblical science also refers to us to Jesus Christ, who in John chapter 1, Jesus is the creator of the universe. Look, there's a whole lot of other topics. Pick one. Jump in. I can't answer all your questions. I'm here for, 3 hours today? Gonna come back tonight, and that's it. And most of you will never see me again. So all I can do is encourage and point. And where I would go, first of all, is the Bible. If we don't know what the Bible actually says, we don't know what questions to ask. And very often as you're reading, something gets answered just because now you understand what it actually says. So if we're not in the Word, we're not going to understand. 2, go to creation.com. Thousands upon thousands of articles, absolutely free. You can read to the end of your life. I don't think you're going to read everything we've ever written. After that, the first thing I'm going to recommend would be Creation Magazine. Now, I say that, I think this is a tool that God used to study me into Christianity. I was maybe 19. I think I was a sophomore in college. And one of my friends drugged me down to a Baptist church in Atlanta. I wasn't a Baptist at the time. That was like going to Mars, honestly. I came out of Episcopalianism. I mean, that's not the same thing. But I go to this church, and there's a guy at the pulpit telling me that evolution isn't true and the earth isn't billions of years old. And I thought that man was crazy. And now I am that man. And I remember going back to my dorm room, and I had a copy of Creation Magazine in my hand. And there was an article in there about something I learned in my evolutionary biology class the day before. And I had no idea the Bible could answer that. And the next page was something in geology I'd always wondered about. And honestly, it's question after question in my mind got answered. I would not be here today were it not for that. That was, what, 1990 maybe, 1988, 1989? That's a long time ago. And I get to work at this organization now. I'm standing in some giant shoes I don't deserve to stand in. Like this field has been plowed. I didn't move the big boulders out of the way. Other people before me did. Friends, we're standing on the shoulders of Christian giants in theology, our Bibles, our translations. I mean, there's so much scholarship that has gone on about people trying to build our faith, leaving it for generations later. And yet, we're all distracted. I am extremely distracted. I mean, Netflix, YouTube, Facebook. I didn't even want to go on TikTok. I'll get lost forever. I mean, the world keeps us very busy and distracted. So we have to be able to stop every once in a while and focus. And honestly, a physical paper magazine, no one has them anymore. And when you see one lying around, in fact, you know what I do with mine when I'm done with it? I leave it at the doctor's office or the dentist or the oil change place. There's my, boop, I just leave it there on the table and I walk away. So if you want to get Creation Magazine, we got to mail it to you. If you get a 2-year version of the magazine, we're going to do something extra though. We're going to sign you up for our digital magazine, which will send you an email, and there'll be a link in it. You click on the link, and we'll let you share it. We say up to 5 devices. We don't count. Shh. So please share it with whom you like. Let them read your Creation Magazine. We'll also give you our monthly mailings, and for a 2-year subscription, I'm going to include 2 DVDs. I know a lot of people don't have DVD players anymore, but you can always hand it to somebody else. Plus, a lot of our newer DVDs, there's a QR code. You hold your phone over the QR code, it pops up thing, and it adds the product to your web store, on creation.com, and you can watch it on anything you like, and then give the DVD to somebody else. That's fine. But I'm going to include that Fallout documentary we talked about earlier. College students, about 35 minutes long. It's quirky, it's fun, it's powerful. And I'm going to include Darwin, the Voyage That Shook the World. We spent nearly $1 million on that. Now, National Geographic, a 1-hour documentary is about $3 million. We did a National Geographic style documentary. We went all around the world chasing Darwin's footsteps. This is in honor of his 200th birthday. And we interviewed some evolutionists, we interviewed some creationists, and we said, if you want to understand this debate, you better understand that guy. And he's not the person that you think he is. He's a very odd bird. Anyway, that's there for you. Here's what our sign-up form looks like. It's a 1-year or 2-year box. We have to put your address down there so we can mail it to you. But if you turn it over, you'll notice there's a place to get gift subscriptions or to give gift subscriptions for somebody. I mean, if I was a kid and I got a magazine with my name on it from grandma, I would have read that thing 20 times over. I'm just saying, it's there for you to take advantage of. All right, guys, you can do that. I'm going to do a couple more things and I'll step down. 1, where do you go after the magazine? I'm going to recommend that red book, the Creation Answers book. I got a big stack of them on the tables out there. We wrote that to answer 99% of the questions we get. So, what about carbon dating? What about Neanderthals? How do you get starlight here from outer space if the universe is only thousands of years old? We answer those questions one at a time in that book. We also have several packs. One of them is called the Starter Pack. It comes with the Creation Answers book, and it comes with the #1 best-selling creation evolution book ever written, Refuting Evolution. It only uses 8th grade science, but it's a powerful book, and it comes with a video presentation also. Here's Evolution's Achilles Heels, the book and the documentary. So if you like to read, if you like to watch, it's there. Powerful information. And this is most of the stuff we do, just like a newspaper is written on like an 8th grade level. This is high school, college level stuff. And all we're using is PhD scientists, just like college professors. So that's there. Or here's a brand new one. Ancient DNA, Illuminating the Tapestry of Biblical Human History. There's a presentation that I gave. I love history, and I love genetics. And genetics, one aspect of genetics is testing theories of history. Well, if the Bible's a history book, then we can test the Bible with genetics. And the Bible actually won. Anyway, that's there for you. Here's a book, Biblical Geology 101. If you're wondering about, basically, I just gave you a Biblical Geology 101 talk. An introduction to the ideas. There's a lot more. Or creation astronomy for kids. I wish I had this when I was 8 years old, 9 years old. There's some really neat stuff in there. In fact, parents, do you know how the solar system works? There's an explanation there. Here's a curriculum we just came out with, Rock Solid Bible Curriculum. Keaton Halley is the author of this, and he did a great job. The illustrations are amazing because he's a graphic artist. But we also have a memory stick with all the PowerPoint slides there. It's there out on the table. Here's Exploring Geology with Mr. Hibb. I talked about exploring dinosaurs with Mr. Hibb in the last talk. Or the Genesis Academy. But look, I did not come here to sell you a book. I came here to encourage you that the answers are out there. The answers are in the scriptures, on creation.com, and yes, in our books. This is what we do. We're here to provide answers to those questions. So I'm going to leave you with 1 Peter 3:15. In your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that's in you. You do it with gentleness and respect. And my friends, we can stand with the Bible in hand, competently and confidently defending it because it is true. But you don't know that until you study yourself into it, and it takes a lot of work. So may God bless you to work. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for this beautiful world that you created for us. Help us to understand and help us to believe what you say about it. But Lord, we also understand this world is cursed. There's so much suffering and cancer and war and murder and horrible things are happening. But help us to understand also that that is because of the curse of Adam. And that you became that curse and you died on the tree to free us from it. So help us to hold tightly to your robes as we go through this world. Help us to understand the word. And Lord, even more so, as we learn, bless us to be brave enough to open our mouths and talk to other people about you. And Lord, bless this little church. Bless them to be a light on a hill in the dark community in which they live, because every evil known to man is right here in this little town. Help them to shine brightly into the darkest corners right here and to be a witness for you, to be true, to be brave, to be pure, and to be working always to the furtherance of the advancement of your kingdom on this planet. Amen.